All right, everyone, you are in the right place. Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar, The Roadmap to Data-Driven Budgeting and Planning. My name is Damian Wade, and I'm the Marketing and Events Coordinator at Cartegraph. And here with me is Michelle Arnold-Kluesner and Gilbert Sanchez. And as Cartegraph's product success strategist, Michelle is responsible for the successful rollout of new Cartegraph features. And in her 6 years at Cartegraph, Michelle has worked with Cartegraph users in a variety of ways. And in fact, she was the business analyst responsible for introducing the Scenario Builder functionality that we will see today. And as one of Cartegraph's senior implementation specialists, Gilbert is responsible for the successful implementation of Cartegraph OMS. And Gilbert has been with Cartegraph a little over 2 years and has implemented over 50 instances of Cartegraph OMS. And prior to being with Cartegraph, he was the Information Technology Manager for Bexar County, Texas. And before we get started, we are accepting your questions. And to submit a question at any time during the course of the webinar, select the Q&A feature located at the top or right-hand side of your screen. And questions will be answered at the conclusion of the webinar. And we'll answer as many questions as time allows. And without further ado, I'll turn things over to Michelle and Gilbert.
Thank you very much, Damian. Hopefully everyone is able to see my screen now so that we can take a look at some of the functionality in the system. So as Damian mentioned, today we are going to talk about data-driven budgeting and planning. The Cartegraph functionality that helps you get there is Scenario Builder. So in our session today, we're actually going to start from the top. We're going to take a look at what you can achieve with this functionality. After you get a chance to see what you can accomplish, then we'll talk about how you get there. We'll take a look at the data that's needed to develop your budget plans and what you can already be doing to help you get to that end goal. Then finally, we'll talk about your expectations for implementation, how you get started, and who will all be involved. So let's go ahead and start taking a look at the functionality. So where we start is over here in Scenario Builder. So for your budgeting and planning needs, we're going to take a look at a few scenarios. So a scenario is a collection of user inputs and calculated outputs to determine what work should be done and when. So inputs are things like asset type, what kind of scenario it is, and the number of years. Outputs are the activities to be performed against what assets, what their total cost is, and their impact. So with information like this, you're able to answer some key questions. For example, how much money do I need to reach our desired network condition? That would be an OCI target scenario. Or what's the impact of decreasing funding levels? So I'm a scenario that is limited by budget. Or what is the cost of a major event? So where I have a scenario where I need to replace everything, such as the case of a flood event. So we're going to start out taking a look at 4 different scenarios that can help us answer questions like this. The 4 scenarios that we're going to take a look at are do nothing, unlimited, a budget of $2 million, and a target OCI of 75, overall condition rating, that's your OCI of 75. So that's 75 out of 100. So let's start a look by taking a look at our do nothing scenario. So with this scenario, you can kind of take a look at what's happening in your network if you actually didn't take any action over, in our case, the next 5 years. So you want to get an idea of what if nothing happens. So you're trying to set your bottom parameter. So over the course of 5 years, if I didn't take any action on what my asset type is here, my pavement, I would see that how this portion of my network started out as a 67, and at the end of that 5 years, it would go down by 11 points. So the condition of this network would get down to a 56. So that gives me my bottom parameter. How low would my network get if there's nothing that I did? So then let's take a look at our top parameter. So what would happen to my network if I accomplished everything that I want? If money was no object and I was able to complete any maintenance protocol that I wanted? Well, we can see that, again, you're starting off at that same 67. I'm looking at the same network or subset of my network, and I'm getting a gain of 30 OCI points. I'm getting my network almost all the way up to 100 for my overall condition. I can see that that would cost me over $7 million. So that's kind of my bottom and my top parameter for this, for my network, or the portion of my network for my pavement here. So if I did nothing, or if I did absolutely everything that fits within my maintenance protocols, I'd end up spending $7 million and getting all the way up to almost a 97 OCI. And I can see I'd be doing a lot in the first year or two to get it up to that level, and then my costs would level off a bit as I just maintain those assets that are in good condition. So, we typically don't get zero funding, and we typically don't get, every dollar that we ask for. So let's try somewhere in between. So what if I were to get a $2 million budget? So maybe that's what I expect my budget to be, or what I hope my budget to be. And so we can take a look at what would happen if I get that budget amount. So again, all these scenarios, it's the same asset pavement, it's the same pavement records, that same portion of my network. So it always starts out at that 67. And I can see with $2 million, I'd maintain that network. I'd get a net gain of 3. So I'm improving it just slightly. So the overall condition for that network would be at that 70. So with that $2 million, I'm spending that evenly across the different years. And so I can see how much I would achieve across those 5 years with the $2 million. So that's one way to go about it. I take a look at, well, what might my budget be? You can ask yourself the opposite question as well. What should my budget be? So you can go by your OCI target. What's the condition that you want your network to be in? And so for this scenario, I said I wanted my network to be at that 75. So it gets me up by 8 points. Again, I'm always starting out at that 67 here. And I go up by 8 points to get me up to that 75. And I can see that I would have to spend $4 million. So it gives me an idea of what budget I should ask for if I have a specific goal in mind for what I wanted to achieve for the condition of my network. So a lot of money spent in year 1 to get me up to that 75. I could certainly have tiered that up if I wanted to. Maybe in the first year get me up to a 70, then a 72, etc. But in this particular case, I just went straight up to a 75 right away in the first year. So the second year, a little less money. I trailed off, and then as I needed to start chip sealing and fixing up those assets that were gotten into good condition, then I'd be spending a little more money once again. So here we're trying to give you an idea of that end result. So after I have everything set up, after I know how to use these scenarios, this may be the type of scenarios that I would utilize the system for, where I want to get that bottom parameter. What would happen if I do nothing? Or I want to get that top parameter. What would happen if I would accomplish all of my protocols? I would complete all the maintenance and capital projects that I wanted to. What would that top result be? And then what are the pieces in the middle? So it gives you that idea of what's going on. So we'll jump into a scenario in more detail, show you how to build one in a little bit. But we wanted to give you an idea of what's the big picture of what you could achieve once you have this functionality in place. So you might be saying to yourself now, well, how did you get there? So we started here with the end result, and now let's go back to the beginning and talk through the path of how you would get there. So first, let's start with your data. So for data-driven results, I need good data. So let's talk about what that data is that you need. So you can create a scenario for any asset type, but my scenario had pavement in it. So let's take a look at my pavement. So the first thing that you need is you need an inventory. If an asset is not in your inventory, I'm certainly not going to be able to recommend action to be taken on that asset. So the first thing you need is just to have your inventory filled out. And, you like some basic information such as location. Here I have pavement classification and functional classification. So step 1 is you have an inventory in your system. As a part of that inventory, it's also a good idea to have a criticality assigned. So criticality is a way of differentiating your higher priority versus your lower priority assets. So in the world of pavement, your arterial roads are probably a higher criticality over your rural roads. That sort of example. So the criticality factor in the Cartegraph system is defaulted to 1, and then you determine which items you want to change to a higher factor. So the higher the number, the higher priority that is, and then the scenarios can utilize that information to prioritize your work. So we have an inventory. We can choose to set a criticality factor, not mandatory, but it certainly helps with our scenarios. And then the other piece that you need is an estimated condition. Estimated condition is really key to be able to generate scenarios. If I want to estimate what work needs to be done in the future, I need to know some information about that asset. And so we use the estimated condition to figure out what that asset's going to look like in the future and then recommend an activity for that asset. So here I can see that my assets have an estimated condition. An estimated condition actually has a couple different things that are needed in order to get that condition estimated. You need two things are mandatory. One is that you have a prediction group. A prediction group shows the deterioration of your asset. So that's the first piece. The second piece is you need to have an asset age. So you need to know how old your asset is to be able to set it somewhere on that prediction group. Now, to make your estimated condition even smarter, it's a great idea to have inspections or activities, some sort of history related to that asset. So let me tell you a little bit more about how estimated conditions work. So I'm going to go into our Asset Condition Manager, and I'm going to take a look at pavement so you can see what these prediction groups look like, and I can try and illustrate for you how these work. So a prediction group is what is used to estimate the condition of an asset. You could have one prediction group, so maybe all of my pavement deteriorates in a similar manner. You could have it that way. Or you can have your prediction groups broken out into subsets. And typically those subsets are material type or maybe variation of use. So I'm going to use my asphalt prediction group. So what this is doing is it's estimating how does this type of asset deteriorate over time. So if my asset is 5 years old, I know that its estimated condition is going to be about an 80. If it's 20 years old, I know its estimated condition is going to be a 56 there. So this is what we use to help estimate the condition of an asset. And again, it's essentially important as a part of your budgeting and planning needs so that you can look out into the future. Now, these estimates are actually quite smart. So every asset that's 20 years old, it's not going to say that, hey, this is a 56. It utilizes the history, the activity of what's been going on in that asset to make that estimated condition even smarter. So it uses two things. It uses inspections and it uses your activity history, your task history. So first off, like I mentioned, I need to know the age of my asset. So I need to know how old it is to give me some sort of place to plot this on the curve. So the age comes from your install task or your replace task. Now, if you do an inspection on that asset, so let's say I have an asset that's 20 years old, but I do an inspection and I say, you know what, that asset is not at a 56 condition. It is down here more like a 43. So based on the analysis that I do, looking at the different condition categories of that asset, I say it's actually closer to a 43. So that 20-year-old asset, we say, you know what, we trust those inspections, you know, someone's visual eyes out there looking at the asset. We trust that condition indicator much more than an estimate from the system. So we set that asset's estimated condition to be that 43. That's what the inspector told us it is. That's what the condition of the asset is. And then that asset deteriorates down from there. So we correct an asset's estimated condition based on the results of an inspection. That's one way that the estimated conditions are smart. The other way that the estimated conditions are smart is it takes a look at what you have done to that asset. So if I did an overlay, if I did a crack seal, each of those activities have an impact to the asset's estimated condition. So now my 20-year-old asset, it is not over here at a 56. My 20-year-old asset, I said, was over here at a 43. But if I do a overlay, maybe I do a 2-inch overlay to this piece of pavement, it will bump that condition up accordingly. So you get to set what you want those impacts to be. So maybe it does an 80% bump in condition, maybe it sets it to an absolute of 90, whatever you think that that activity should have as its impact. So all of those pieces factor into our estimated condition. So estimated condition is a fun topic. I love talking about it. It's something I could talk about for an hour or two. It definitely is something that takes a little bit of setup. But this is one of the prerequisites to using that scenario functionality for your financial planning and budgeting. But let's get back to what our data looks like. So we said that in order to have data-driven results, I need good data. And those pieces of data that I need are an inventory. I need to know what assets I have. It's a good idea to have a criticality, because then I can base my planning and budgeting based on the priority of my assets. And you need to have an estimated condition. That estimated condition, you at minimum need to know the asset's age, so when it was installed or replaced, and then you can make that estimate even more accurate by having had an inspection or having documented the history of tasks or activities done to that asset. So those are the pieces that you need. So the minimum is that inventory and that estimated condition, but that criticality, that activity history, that inspection history makes it even better. So that's the first part of your good data, that good, solid inventory data, that condition estimates. So then you're ready to use your scenario builder functionality for budgeting and planning. Well, the first part of getting your scenario builder to work is protocols. So let's take a look at protocols next. Now, scenario builder functionality works for any asset type. You simply need to have a protocol set up for that asset type. So in my system here, I have some protocols set up for pavement, sewer mains, and signs. Now, what a protocol is a protocol determines what activity should be done, when it should be done, and how much it's going to cost. So basically, it's the brains behind a scenario. It's the instructions that the scenario has for what it should do to be able to calculate out into the future. So let me just take a look at the pavement one that we were using in our scenarios. So the protocol lists all the different activities that I want the scenario to take into account. So a chip seal, crack seal, overlay, all of these different items. So what should be done, when it should be done. So here I have it based on estimated OCI range. So if my asset is between a 50 and a 60, I want to do an overlay. But if it's between a 60 and a 75, I'm going to do a patch. So you identify what activities and when you want those activities to be done. And then finally, a cost. So the cost that I have set up here is a certain dollar amount per square foot. And then I have an overhead cost associated as well. So my chip seal is $3 a square foot, and then I have a $400 overhead charge. So the protocols are the brains behind the scenario. They are what's used to determine what activities should be recommended and when those activities should be recommended. Again, no matter what asset type you have, you can set up a protocol for that asset type. And as long as you have a protocol, then you can run a scenario. Now, keep in mind, you can actually have many different protocols. So I have one protocol for concrete and a separate one for all pavement, but I can create as many protocols as I'd like, just specifically on pavement. So I could have one protocol or series of protocols for a very aggressive maintenance approach, where I'm going to overlay as soon as it gets down to a 70, something like that. So, or you want to be very aggressive. Then you could have a separate protocol that's much more conservative. You want to wait until the pavement is in much worse shape before you recommend an overlay. And then you can run a scenario with your aggressive protocol and run a scenario with your conservative protocol and see what the difference is in how much it costs and see what the difference is to the overall impact of your network. So you can use multiple protocols in that manner. You can also use a protocol to help you estimate the cost of a major event, such as a flood. So you can set up a protocol where the activity is to replace the asset, no matter what condition it's in, because then you would filter that scenario down to all the assets that are within your floodplain, and then you could estimate the cost to replace all of those assets, assuming that the flood completely requires a replacement of those assets. So that's another way to use a protocol. Or within the protocols, you could simply tweak costs. So maybe I have a protocol for activities and what the cost would be if I internally source that work. And then I have a different protocol with my activities, same activities, but I have the cost of what that would be to outsource that work. So we definitely encourage you to have different protocols to help give you different scenarios with different views as to what work's going on. All right, so we're getting closer to the top there. We took a look at our data because we need good data to have good results. And then we took a look at, what's the brains behind the scenario so that we can get to that point of actually running a scenario. So let's go to the end, which was our beginning in Scenario Builder. So I'm going to go ahead and create a scenario. So I'm going to use whatever I want for my name here. I'll just call it example 1 today. Again, you can run a scenario on any asset type, but I'm going to use pavement once again, since that's the example that we've been looking at. Now, I can choose to do a scenario across my entire network or just a subset of my network. Maybe I want to focus on a particular neighborhood. Maybe I want to focus on just arterial roads. So I can filter it down to the area that I want to focus on for this scenario. I have a really small network here, only about 100 segments, so I'm going to keep my scenario for my entire network. Next is my start date. So the start date you typically have is the beginning of your fiscal year. So, this is mainly a budgeting and planning tool. So we typically like to use it for the fiscal year. And then number of years, I could do 1 year, 10 years, 100 years, whatever I would like there. So our last scenario had 5 years, so let's try 10 years this time. And then it's our scenario type. So do I want to look at budget limitation? Do I want to ask the question of what can I achieve with this much money? Do I want to do an OCI targeted budget, where the question is how much is it going to cost to achieve my goal of a particular network condition? Or do I want unlimited, where I will run every protocol and do as much as I possibly can, no matter the cost? So I can pick any of those scenarios. I'm going to go with OCI target. So if I'm going to go with OCI target, then I need to set some sort of target. So we'll do a target of an 85 across those 10 years. The next setting is our activity sequence. So how do I want to prioritize this work? If I prioritize by projected date, that means that just do the first thing that comes due. If, hey, it's time to do an overlay, go ahead and do that overlay. That's by projected date. So as soon as it's recommended that an activity should occur, go ahead and do that activity. Or I could do it by asset criticality and lowest estimated OCI. So that is doing my worst condition assets first, my highest critical assets that are in worst condition. Or prioritize based on highest critical assets and best condition. So I want to do best first, which can be a better use of funds to maintain the items that are already in decent condition. Or I can do straight up by asset criticality. Take my highest priority asset. Does anything need to be done? If it does, do it. And then move down from there. I'm going to focus on asset criticality and lowest OCI. I want to get my network into a great condition. So here I can modify the weights. So if I want criticality to be a slightly higher weight than estimated OCI or vice versa, I can tweak those two numbers. So if I want criticality to have twice as much weight as my estimated OCI, I can do that. And then the final setting here is recommend single activity by. So with the scenarios, we only recommended one action per asset per year. So if this main street needs something, needs 2 activities done to it, maybe it qualifies for both a patch and an overlay. Which one do I want the system to recommend? I'm not going to do both of those. So I could go with lowest cost. So that would probably end up being my patch. I could recommend based on highest impact, so that would probably be my overlay. I could recommend by first qualifying, so which one came due first, which one was recommended first. Or I could recommend by best value, so what is the highest impact for the lowest cost. So you get to pick your parameter there. And then I can add in some sort of description if I want to do that, and I will save. So now I'm into my scenario detail, and I can make some tweaks here. So this one was an OCI target, and I said that my target was 85. But maybe I want to work my way up to that 85. Otherwise, I'm going to be spending a lot of money in that first year. So maybe I want to start out, I'm going to start out with a 70. So I think this network starts out at a 67, so I wouldn't have too far to go there. And then I'll just jump up by a few points each year. So this way I don't have an overabundance of money spent in the first year. I'm going to work my way up to that 85 and then just have to maintain the 85. I'll also want to make sure I get my protocols added in there. So what is the maintenance approach that I'm taking here? So I could add in multiple protocols. Maybe I have one protocol for my concrete roads and a separate protocol for my asphalt roads. Maybe the way in which I do activities or the timing in which I do activities are different. So I could add as many protocols as necessary to this, but for this example, I just have the one. So I have set my settings, I've adjusted my plan years, I have my protocols in place, and then all you need to do is run your scenario. So it's going to calculate out all these pieces of data, and look how fast that was. So I'm able to calculate out what activities should be done across those 10 years in what seems like just a few seconds there. I have 520 activities that were recommended. And so here I see my results. So like I expected, I didn't spend a ton of money in the first year because I only had that to go from that 67 to the 70. Going from 70 up to 75 was a lot more money, so I took more, there was more cost in those 2 years. But then it kind of trailed off after that because I just had to maintain that network at that 85 overall condition. So I can see a lot of detail about what the scenario recommended here. I can see that that there were 108 assets that were affected with a total of 520 activities. So I actually did at least one activity on every single asset across those 10 years. And each year I have an average of about 52 activities that I'm doing. I can take a look at what the different activities were. So in that first year I did a couple overlays and a couple patches. Got much more colorful the second year. I had a lot more different activities going on. But then after I got my network up to that 85 that I was looking for, it was more maintenance focused, more crack seals, patches, chip seals, that sort of thing. So I can see how that money was spent activity-wise. And there's a couple other charts that you have here too. So I can compare this scenario to some of the other scenarios that I had, and I can just take a look at some of my different results there. I can see the information by plan year, again, how the OCI changed from year to year. I can see what the cost was from year to year, how many assets had work done on them from year to year, so lots of great detail there. And of course, I have the entire list of activities that were recommended. So I can see what activity was recommended for what asset, how much it cost, and what was the impact to that asset. So I can see all that detail here as well. So just the asset ID doesn't give me a ton of information about what that asset is. So what's the name of the street? What are those other pieces of information? So if I want to be able to see a lot of detail about the asset, we find that a good way to do that is by doing a quick export. And so up from the actions here, I can take a quick export of the activities with the asset attributes. So that downloads that file for me so that I'm able to see even more detail. So you can determine what fields of information you want to see about your asset in this export. But here I can see the street that pavement segment is on, its functional classification, its pavement classification, and I can include whatever other pieces of information I would want to see here. So I am able to take a look at what these scenarios can do for me. It's able to look into the future and estimate what activities would need to be done at what cost so that I can plan into the future. All right. So we've taken a look at the functionality that you have here. Let me give you a chance. Next up is going to be Gilbert. So we've taken a look at this functionality, taken a look at how it works to see what you can achieve with data-driven budgeting and planning. So the next piece, Gilbert is going to talk to us more about the implementation process and what you can expect there. So Gilbert is getting set up to present for us.
Thanks, Michelle, and welcome everybody. Let me just log in real quick. And so at this point, you may be asking, when should I expect to begin a scenario builder implementation? And that question really depends on the maturity of the data that you have in OMS and the resources available to configure the OMS for scenario builder. Michelle touched on that a little bit, and I'm going to get into it a little bit more here in a second. Most customers, when they first implement OMS as a system, are not ready to implement Scenario Builder. Although I've had a small number of customers who have chosen one asset, and most of the time it's been pavement because most of the time they have the necessary data to configure the system to allow them to run scenarios against that particular asset. Of course, we already know that a properly configured OMS environment is key for producing accurate and useful scenarios. For the most part, though, that is the exception rather than the norm. Most customers are not ready to implement Scenario Builder day one when they go live into production with OMS. From my experience of implementing Scenario Builder, I would estimate that a good 6 to 12 months of using OMS, along with gathering the necessary data over that time, will set you up for a successful implementation of Scenario Builder. So you may be asking, what does it take to start running Scenario Builder? And so we'll spend some time reviewing Asset Condition Manager. And as Michelle mentioned, we could spend hours, maybe days, running over Asset Condition Manager. And so this is a requirement for configuration so that Scenario Builder produces accurate scenarios. So I'm going to jump into Asset Condition Manager. We do offer other webinars and other training is available for this specific section of OMS. So if you're interested in learning more about Asset Condition Manager, Damien can give you some resources for that. And so that being said, of course, Michelle mentioned that we need an install date for your assets and possibly a criticality factor for your assets configured in OMS so that you can run scenarios against that asset. The date will be used to estimate the current condition of the asset based on the configuration of Asset Condition Manager, which is condition categories, prediction groups, and performance curves. As I mentioned, Scenario Builder is dependent on configuration of these parts so that Scenario Builder can generate good scenarios. And so that being said, we'll jump into Asset Condition Manager and we'll just choose pavement since that's the one we've been looking at. And so you can see there's three tabs here: condition categories, prediction groups, and condition groups. We won't cover condition groups today, but we'll spend some time on condition groups, condition categories, and prediction groups. So you may be wondering what condition categories are. And so condition categories are nothing more than characteristics observed during inspections and can be used to estimate asset deterioration. So the system creates some system calculated condition categories, such as for signs, it automatically creates background RA and legend RA. And for pavement, it creates PCI. Customers also have the ability to create their own condition categories for their own asset types, so keep that in mind. Once a customer has configured a condition category, so you can see here, these are listed on the left-hand side, now we have to define impacts. And so impacts are nothing more than activities that have an impact on the overall condition of the asset. And so right now, we're just going to look at PCI as an example. And so we scroll down and we see impacts. We see that we have 5 activities that could possibly impact the condition of the pavement asset. And so there are 3 types of choices, right? There's for impact. So you have a relative impact, a percentage impact, and an absolute impact. And so we have all 3 displayed here on the screen. So as you can see here, crack seal has an impact of 15 relative. And what that means is that adds 15 points to the current condition of the asset. Overlay, patch, and slurry have a percentage. So basically the system calculates the percentage and adds the appropriate points based on the current condition of the asset. And then of course we have replace, which takes the asset back to brand new, so it's 100 absolutes. Once you've configured the condition categories and activities that impact the overall condition, now the next step is to configure prediction groups. And so if we jump over to the second tab, prediction groups, and Michelle touched on this already, so I'll choose asphalt. And so for each of the condition categories that participate in this prediction group, you're going to build what we call performance curves. And so you can see here that we have many points that create that curve. And so you can use multiple points to create a performance curve. But in actuality, a performance curve can be a straight line. And so if I jump down to paved numbers, you can see that we have a beginning point, which is the born on date of the, or the born year of the asset. So you can see that at year 0, it's 100. And we're saying at year 5, this particular curve is 0. And so all these add up to what we call the OCI, which is the red line here, which Scenario Builder will use to calculate the condition or the future condition of the asset. Once we've configured the performance curve, then we are ready to run scenarios. And so basically these performance curves reflect the anticipated deterioration of each condition category. And as a result, Scenario Builder will use this configuration to estimate the condition of the assets in the scenario and produce a list of activities necessary to meet the requirements of the scenario, which Michelle already outlined. So that being said, at this point you're wondering who should be involved in the Scenario Builder implementation. And our recommendations would be that administrators of the system to configure the necessary areas of the system. So asset condition manager for one, install dates, field workers to do inspections and populate the install dates. And then you will need employees who have intimate knowledge of costs associated with performing certain activities. And that's going to be used when you develop protocols and triggers where you assign appropriate costs for each of those activities. And then along those lines, you'll want to involve employees who have intimate knowledge of what activities have impacts on the condition of an asset. And of course, optionally, Cartegraph does provide implementation services, so if you're interested in that, you can let us know. And so that being said, you're probably wondering, what should I do now? So 100% depends on your readiness to implement Scenario Builder for at least one asset based on the areas and information that we provided you today. If you meet that requirement for at least one asset and the configuration is configured in the system, then you can run and begin running scenarios for that asset. If you are new to OMS and just beginning to gather assets and entering data in the system, entering or implementing Scenario Builder for at least one asset should be a minimum of 6 months. That should be a 6-month goal. And if you do not have performance curves, we recommend that your research should be done to see how assets perform in your area for that specific asset type. And then inspections should be done on each of the assets so that you get a current OCI. And then that'll provide you a current condition of the asset. And then we do not recommend attempting to configure Scenario Builder requirements for all asset types at the initial deployment of OMS, as it could become overwhelming. All right, so that being said, I'll hand it over to Damien and Michelle. And so Thank you very much.
All right, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to submit them now. Michelle, we have a few questions already. Can you create a constant cost per year scenario?
So a constant cost per year scenario. So I guess I'm having trouble understanding that question a bit. So you want to have a constant cost per year. So let me attempt, if the person who typed it in wants to add in some follow-up information, that'd be great. So let me share my screen here and see what I can do to help you out. So a constant cost per scenario, perhaps you mean the same budget value for each year. If that is what you mean, then let me go into one of my budget limitation scenarios. And I love this feature. You can just go ahead and duplicate. So if you duplicate a scenario, then you can make changes to it. And let me just hit save here. So here we have what the budget is for each year. So I have my scenario target is a $2 million budget, and I see what the budget amount is for each year. So I can have the same budget value for each year. That may be what you're referring to. The other piece that you may be referring to would be within the protocols. So within the protocols, the cost that you put for that activity is the cost that is used for every year that that activity is run. So hopefully that information provides the answer to your question. If not, feel free to follow up by typing in some more information.
Okay, and then can you also tell Scenario Builder what funding you have available and it chooses the best fit project sequence?
So based on what funding you have available, so you would want to build a budget limitation scenario for that particular case, and you still need to identify some sort of protocol. So you need to say, well, what's the type of activities I would do? What would I accomplish for this asset? And then I'd probably recommend that you set it as best value, and it will recommend what specific activities you should accomplish within that budget so that you fit within that budget and you see that list of activities that are recommended.
Okay, and can you create tasks directly from the Scenario Builder list of suggested activities?
So the way that we recommend going about that is a couple different ways. So we actually talked to a lot of clients who've used our predecessor to Scenario Builder about how we previously had a functionality similar to this called Pave Plus. So I actually did a lot of interviewing with those clients to see how they utilize that system. And there was a feature in there to turn the recommended activities into tasks, and I didn't find a single person who used it. And the reason for that was a couple-fold. One was because it's a system recommended activity. They really like to send somebody out and do it. So the scenario was a guideline. They'd send somebody out and they'd validate that that's really what they wanted to accomplish. So they used the scenario as a starting point, and then they utilized their internal resources to make actual decisions, and based on those decisions is when they scheduled the work. So what we recommend that you do is, based on these results, you can go ahead and create a web map. So that web map is then consumed in Cartegraph so that you can see where the work is, what the type of activities that are recommended are. So you can see that information, and you overlay it with your tasks and compare that to what you already have scheduled. So once you have those pieces of information laid together, then you can choose what are the pieces that you actually want to accomplish, select your assets, and create the tasks from there. So that's the approach that we see customers using. The other thing that you can do is that you can take that export of activities and import them directly into your tasks. You want to be careful with that approach. You certainly wouldn't want to do all 10 years of a 10-year plan. You'd maybe want to start with year one and perhaps import those activities into tasks and go from there. So we definitely want to call out that this is a budget-focused tool, giving you idea of what you can accomplish with a certain budget. Most of the customers want to apply an additional level of analysis before actually getting out there and scheduling the work.
Okay, and then we have a follow-up question here. In your scenario, you edited the initial target OCI for the early years in order to avoid front-loading the cost. can you create a scenario which would A, reach a specified target OCI, while B, smoothing the cost as much as possible, and without guessing at the OCI targets, which would smooth it?
Sure. So so we don't have a scenario type that allows you to specify target OCI and budget, which I think is kind of what you're getting at there. So the way that we recommend going about that is to utilize that duplicate feature. So run a scenario, see what that gets me, and be like, oh, that was a lot of money spent in the first year. Let me tweak down the OCI in the first year. Run it again. Is that getting me closer to what I want? So as we saw, it is extremely easy to take a scenario, duplicate it. Let me see, we'll call this example 2A. Let me change my budget limitation or change my OCI target, save that, run the scenario, and it's within only a couple minutes that I am having a new example of my scenario. So we recommend tweaking as you see results, adjusting it to where you want it to end up being. So that's why we really focused on performance with this functionality. We made sure that you could create scenario after scenario, run them in a minute's time so that you can get it down to where what you want to achieve and how.
Does Scenario Builder account for cost inflation over time?
No, that is one of the pieces that missed the cut when we implemented this functionality, and it is at the top of our priority list for new features related to that. So it does not adjust for inflation at this point.
Okay, and can you provide an example of running a scenario with the fleet module?
Sure. So I actually saw that question, and I got a little something set up while Gilbert was talking, so thanks there, Gilbert, for giving me a little time. So first I want to point out that our fleet functionality really focuses a lot on preventative maintenance. And so we see a lot of our fleet users heavily using the preventative maintenance functionality, where it's based on the miles that have been driven or the usage for what maintenance activity is recommended next. So I wanted to point out that that is a great application for the fleet functionality. For Scenario Builder, it would really work in much the same way as pavement, which you just saw. So while Gilbert was talking, I went ahead and I created a protocol for fleet. So that would just be working at our equipment. So with that equipment, I just did a really quick example, something really simple. I said that once the equipment gets below an estimated OCI of 40, then we're going to go ahead and replacement. And I just threw in a standard cost of, we're going to say it's going to cost us $50,000 to replace that piece of equipment. So I got my information set up, my protocol set up, the brains behind it. If I take a look at my data, so again, you want data-driven results, you need to have good data. Only a subset of my assets here have an estimated OCI. So I'm only going to be able to get recommendations on my assets which have estimated OCI. So we have to keep that in mind. You need good data for data-driven results. Well, let's go ahead and create a scenario for equipment. So we'll just call this our equipment example. And we'll use equipment as our asset. I'll just use today for a scenario start date. And let's do this over, let's say 30 years. So we don't have a lot of equipment there, so we want to grab whatever we can. And I'll just fill out some of my other fields and save my result. I want to attach in that protocol that I had specified for my equipment. And let's run our scenario and see what happens. So this is an example of where you simply want to identify how much equipment is going to need to be replaced in the next 30 years. And we can see that I have a cost of $250,000 in the first year, so I have a few that need to be replaced. And then it's going to bump up in those specific years. So if I take a look at the assets included, so in the first year I'm going to need to replace 5 pieces of equipment, then 1, then it's going to be a few years until I need to replace 3 down in 2026, and moving on from there. So that's a quick example with equipment.